Okay. Good evening, everyone. My name is Nicholas Manousis. I'm the Executive Director of the Horological Society of New York, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here to our September meeting. Let's get started with some news. The last time we had a lecture was on March 2nd, and a lot has changed since then. Because of the pandemic, all of our in-person classes and lectures are canceled for the foreseeable future. Instead, HSNY is offering virtual horological education classes and holding virtual lectures. While we miss seeing everyone in person, we are looking forward to turning this difficult situation into a positive way forward. For the first time in HSNY's 154-year history, we are now live streaming our lectures. Tonight, we have almost 300 people tuned in from all over the world. At the end of tonight's lecture, we'll have time for questions, and you can submit your questions using Zoom's Q&A feature. And remember, you can rearrange the video windows on your screen in case we're blocking any of the slides. Unfortunately, we had to cancel our 2020 gala and charity auction. Even without our annual gala, we had an incredible year in terms of financial aid. HSNY awarded $30,000 in Henry B. Freed scholarships, $25,000 in Howard Robbins Awards, and $100,000 in Working Watchmakers grants. In total, HSNY distributed $155,000 in financial aid for 2020. This record amount was made possible by our generous donors, members, and sponsors. Speaking of sponsors, I'm happy to announce the Swiss watchmaker Jacques-Drouot has joined HSNY as a sponsor. Through sponsorship, Jacques-Drouot joins America's oldest watchmaking guild in its mission to advance the art and science of horology through education. Thank you to all of our friends at Jacques-Drouot for their kind support. Okay, now on to the main event, on to tonight's lecture. The economic impact of the pandemic is substantial, and it's affected nearly every industry on the planet. Even so, interest in mechanical watches is very strong. This leads us to the question, what does the future look like for the watch industry? Our speaker for tonight's lecture is well qualified to propose an answer. Eric Koo is an internationally recognized expert in vintage and contemporary watches. I'm pleased to welcome Eric Koo to lecture at the Horological Society of New York. Eric, take it away.
Hi, everybody. I think tonight is an evening of many firsts. It's my first Zoom lecture, my first PowerPoint presentation I've done probably since college, and the first Zoom lecture in the history of the HSNY, and also the first lecture that the HSNY has had since the phrase social distancing has entered our vocabulary. I'm grateful to Nicholas and the Horological Society for having me here today, and to all of you for joining in from near and far to hear me talk about watches. I figured today I at least get half dressed and put on a nice shirt, but underneath, I assure you, I'm just wearing shorts and sandals. So on that note, I think we'll start off the evening first with some humor. In March, this is what we thought would happen. These memes are courtesy of my good friend, You Can Never Have Enough, by the way. But on the contrary, this is what actually happened. And what about the auctions? So we're going to start off by talking about the breakdown of sales from March 2020 to now. We'll take a look at the visuals of what really happened in the last 6 months. First, I'd like to acknowledge Reg Brock and MPD Group for providing me this chart as well as the following one after. What we see here is January and February that were up double digits over the previous year. Then March was severely impacted by COVID as the travel bans and shelter-in-place orders took effect. In April, we were at the worst, but between May and June, things recovered quite quickly. And by July, we were pretty much even with 2019. You can see that this is what they call a V-shaped recovery. And then here's another chart that shows a similar thing, but also gauged against rest of market. So these charts show luxury watches, which are $3,000 and up, and then ROM stands for rest of market. And you can see that on one hand, the luxury watch sales went down a lot more than the rest of the market, but at the same time, it rebounded faster. This only goes to June, but you could probably see in July the trend continuing. And Reg here says the luxury consumer has shifted much of their spend away from canceled travel and experiences, leading to an accelerated recovery in the luxury end of the watch market, with men greatly over-indexing to women. So first, we'll talk about the authorized dealers. Most, if not all, brick and mortar shops were faced with shutdown and shelter-in-place directives, many of which are still now in effect. I happen to live in California. Indoor malls are still closed where I am, and I know that's the same for a lot of other places. Some retail is around, but most are still closed. Many brands have rules that prevent their authorized dealers from selling over the phone or internet. This is one thing that I think moving forward probably needs to be addressed. In the store, clearly is the best experience for buyers, but if things don't improve in the long term, there has to be ways for enthusiasts to buy remotely. Sales essentially ground to a halt because of the lack of product coming in from the manufacturers, as well as actual closures of the stores. This in turn basically caused dealers to have to renegotiate with landlords for rental concessions, forbearances, etc. This was met with some success with some people. Some didn't get any discounts. You know, it was really dependent on kind of a case-by-case basis. And as of July, June, shipments have started to resume after several months of dealers adjusting to the new norm as they try to slowly recover. Next, we'll talk about the brands. So I chose to talk about like what I call like the big three, which are AP, Patek Philippe, and Rolex. So we'll start with AP. First off, the manufacturer was closed from mid-March until mid-May. And during that time, obviously, no watches were being shipped out. No watches were in process of manufacture. It's pretty interesting that AP, for one of the large brands, actually has a very small retail footprint in the United States. They have 9 boutiques and 6 retailers in the USA. The boutiques include company-owned ones as well as joint ventures. And because of this and their small dealer network, they were able to pivot quite quickly to adjust their selling strategies. Some of the things they did, including holding Zoom calls directly with collectors to show new pieces and the ability to transact virtually. I know, for example, a friend of mine who works for AP, Errol, was able to travel around showing some of the new collection watches. I was able to meet him in San Francisco and view the newest Code 1159 watches. And then this was an interesting quote that Francois, the CEO, said, which was, "Watchmakers do not need stores." This was followed up by talking about what he described as the dematerialization of retail, and how we don't need four walls to sell watches tomorrow. And, you know, the brand clearly feels very strongly that some of the changes that we have seen now during COVID have to probably remain and extend past, you know, these difficult times, and will kind of become permanent. And it was interesting to note also that there was in one interview that he did where he referenced the fact that during the shutdown, I think in May and June, that the boutiques were able to sell 40 of the remaster 101s, which were delivered virtually to customers without having to be in the stores. I myself got one as well. And, you know, you can do the math really quickly, and that's a couple $1 million in revenue, even though the stores were closed. And they previously announced that they were leaving SIHH, and it seems like they're going with this strategy of staggered releases over the year. So the COVID thing and cancellation of trade shows didn't really affect their new product releases. We'll talk next about Patek Philippe. And so the Patek manufacturer was closed from March 18th until April 27th. They were open slightly earlier than AP. They have 69 points of sale in the USA, all which are authorized retailers and not company-owned salons. And it was interesting that during this time, they just completed their $600 million new production facility, which opened in spring of 2020. And to help dealers during the pandemic, they had a pretty interesting strategy. They actually allowed for short-term online sales of in-stock watches by authorized dealers. It's quite a mouthful there. They're the only one of the big three that were that did something along these lines. And in regards to this online strategy, I actually spoke with a number of dealers, and they said that although it was a great idea, they actually recorded minimal sales activity from listing these things online. And to preempt questions later, there were no steel Nautiluses or Aquanauts there, unfortunately. And anecdotally, I had heard that after shipping resumed, they were able to ship some top sellers to the dealers to kind of help them out for the time when they were closed. The press outlets have reported no new releases in 2020, but we've already seen that 6007A, the steel Calatrava, come out and to commemorate the production facility opening. And maybe we'll see more watches in the fall, but it's undetermined at this point. And, you know, with COVID shutting in-person events down, we all know what happened to Basel World, and Patek has committed to showing new novelties going forward with Rolex in a show format starting in 2021 in Geneva. So next, we'll talk about Rolex. So their manufacturer was closed from March 17th until May 4th. Similar time frame to the other guys. There are approximately 300 points of sale in the United States, which is a lot more than Patek and AP. Now, Rolex did not allow for website sales during the pandemic, and their official policy is still for all sales to be conducted in store. They don't really like dealers to be selling on the internet, obviously, and via telephone, and the deals have to be done in store. Like Patek, we had heard that when shipping resumed, Rolex sent increased allocations of desirable watches to their new retailers. We saw some things like a lot of steel sports watches were being shipped. Many dealers reported getting black GMTs, which were discontinued and they hadn't seen in some time. So it's kind of interesting. And Rolex just announced their 2020 releases on September 1st. Maybe there'll be more product coming, maybe not. And an interesting byproduct of this late release is that they were able to prepare for it. And basically, after September 1st, the watches were shipped to retailers immediately, and people were able to purchase them. I was able to get this yellow oyster perpetual, I think on the 1st or 2nd, and it's kind of an interesting way of doing things, to be able to get product out so quickly after release. And like Patek, no more Basel World, as we know, but they're going to be continuing doing releases in 2021 in a show format in Geneva. We'll talk next about the gray market. By gray market, I mean not official channels, secondhand dealers, things of that nature. So the first point is that according to Chrono24, they say that sales were up year-to-date 13% over pre-COVID times. This is interesting because obviously buyers can't physically go to a retailer and buy something. And even when they could, stock was severely limited. So Chrono24 was the best place for a lot of people to shop. An informal survey of many secondary, gray market, used vintage dealers basically echoes everything that Chrono24 said, that sales were off the charts. They couldn't keep stock in, and they also couldn't replace their stock. Another thing that I thought was kind of interesting was that I felt that there was a lot of stronger content coming out from watch blogs and on online and the watch media. And I feel that translated to more interest and stronger sales. Customers were more engaged. If they were sitting at home, not really working all the time, they were probably surfing the internet, looking for cool things to buy, a lot of which happened to be watches. And then things such as long form interviews, articles on Houdinki, Zoom gatherings, etc., like this one, this all fostered to like more interest being given to watches and collecting watches. So not only was the demand strong, but prices were strong for most things, especially so for new modern Patek and Rolex. These are, of course, all the candy pieces like steel Nautiluses, Aquanauts, and any sort of sport Rolex. So the rise in secondhand gray market prices is because the primary market is not operating as normal. As a result, even less product filters into the secondary market. What I mean by that is, for example, if an authorized dealer usually gets, I don't know, 3 5711 Nautiluses a month, you know, maybe of those, typically one somehow gets onto the secondary market. But if suddenly they're only getting one, then it won't be on the secondary market, and it'll just go onto the wrist of a waiting client. Then the supply gets severely restricted, lower down on the supply chain. And then finally, stay-at-home orders equal time to whip out the credit card. I don't know, now I see there's 350 odd participants right now. I'm pretty sure most of you were either looking at watches most of the time, bought something, or a combination of both things. So next, we'll talk about the auction houses. So this is a infographic that I put together with the help of Nicholas Biebeck from Blackbird in Hong Kong. He helped me compile this information. And I would say that although it might not be 100% accurate, it's close enough to it in that any differences in the totals would not affect overall standings. Obviously, we have to factor in exchange rates and things of that nature. You can see here that basically, you know, one thing that's apparent is right now Sotheby's had the highest sales total, but you can also see that sale locations, Sotheby's was managed to do an astounding 67 sales, while the other competitors, you know, had 2 or maybe 3. And then you can see on the right here a breakdown of the of sales as a relationship to the size of the market in the auction world. I'll give you guys a few more seconds to kind of digest this information here. Okay. So first we'll talk about Sotheby's. Now Sotheby's, as you can see from the previous chart, they're currently the market leader in sales. Highlights for them include $3.3 million for a lapis styled unique platinum Zenith Daytona, and $1.6 million for a reference 6264 Rolex Paul Newman Daytona JPS, which is interesting for the fact that it was sold in a single lot online sale, which was the first, and it's something that you see more often in the art world. It's interesting to note that their sales increase, I think, is attributable to the fact that they were the quickest of the big auction houses in terms of pivoting strategy. As we know, Sotheby's went private last year, and everyone wondered what would happen and what kind of strategies would change for them. And who knows if these diffuse online sales were in the works already, or if it was a quick reaction to the economic climate. But clearly they benefited from that. And they started with weekly small sales consisting of maybe 10 to 20 lots at a time that were curated by New York, Geneva, and Hong Kong teams. And they generated consistent sales and revenue. Although most of the sales were not for expensive lots, even small value items in consistent high quantities like this kind of add up. And their traditional in-person sales were delayed, but ended up taking place. Sotheby's in Hong Kong kind of does their own, spring and fall auction season that's not 100% aligned with the other auction houses. But, the results across the board were pretty strong given the circumstances. And they resulted in, I don't remember the total amount of sales, but I remember reading that it said, year to date, Sotheby's is down 25% from 2019, but given the circumstances, I think that's pretty good. And then here are a couple of photos. It's pretty interesting. I mentioned that single lot sale on the left, and Sotheby's really did a lot to kind of promote that gold Paul Newman sale, which did very well, obviously. And on the left, you see this auctioneer, Oliver Barker, wearing this 6264 JPS during the Rembrandt to Richter sale, and which was one of their big online traditional art sales. And you see that beaming smile on his face as he hammers down, some art lot for $100 million. And on his wrist is, of course, that gold JPS. And on the right-hand side, we see this interesting and unique as we know it, Zenith Daytona featuring a lapis dial and a platinum case. It was kind of funny. People made a lot of comments to me that they thought that the strap was really ugly. I don't really know, I don't really have that much of an opinion on it, but I can tell you that the reason it's not on your typical alligator strap is that, these things get shipped around internationally a lot. And, with CITES issues dealing with exotic materials, it's just not practical. So it just has to go on a, like a calfskin strap. So next, we will talk a little bit about Phillips. Now, Phillips came in a close second place. They were very close in terms of overall sales compared with Sotheby's. But what makes it really interesting and remarkable is that they did this all with just 2 in-person sales. They were the first, kind of like the bellwether of this whole industry, because they were the first sale after COVID. And that sale in Geneva achieved an amazing 30+ million Swiss francs. And it achieved a 100% white glove sell-through. And it's interesting that Phillips, instead of pivoting to a strategy of online sales, they decided to go with the traditional sale model, but augmenting it to increase online bidding. And Phillips was able to play up on their strengths, which of course include the auctioneering skills of R.L. Box, the maestro with the golden gavel. And you can see that that resulted in over 2,000 registered bidders online, which was a record for any sort of watch sale with any of the auction houses. Now, they set several records as well. And one of the things here you can see is they especially did well with independents. They had two very interesting FP Journe watches, which both set records. I know there's a lot of interest with that brand right now, and with these watches in particular. The subscription tourbillon brought over 1.5 Swiss francs, and that unique two-tone resonance brought slightly less, with over 1.1 million Swiss francs. And not to be outdone by the Geneva sale, the Hong Kong one was quite successful as well. It sold through 99% by lots and by value. And they have also kind of introduced new ways of doing things. They started doing direct previews with clients from the comfort of their own home. You know, Aurel and team have been doing this with a lot of collectors, and they've also been conducting webinars via Zoom and various previews directly with buyers. And they've also started kind of dabbling with online watch sales. They have one going on right now called Intersect Online, which is a multidisciplinary sale, which features art, jewelry, as well as some interesting watch lots. Here we have a picture of two of their most interesting lots, being the two Journes. The one on the left being excuse me, the Resonance with a two-tone case, which was unique. And then on the right, the number 14 out of 20, the early tourbillon. Next, we'll talk a bit about Christie's. Now, Christie's was able to pull off 2 online sales and 2 in-person sales this half of the year. And their big sale was the one that they did in Hong Kong, and it did nearly 20 million Swiss francs total. It was the largest sale this season in Hong Kong, you know, compared to Sotheby's, Phillips, and Antiquorum. And one of their big highlights from that sale was the titanium 5033 minute repeater by Patek Philippe, and it sold all in for just under 1.8 million Swiss francs. It's interesting to note that with Christie's, you know, that balance that we usually see between Geneva being the strong auction and then Hong Kong kind of in a close second place, it's shifted quite a bit, with Christie's really promoting very strongly this Hong Kong sale, the titanium collection inside, which we saw the first half of, which will continue in the fall. And, you know, as a result, Hong Kong sales have represented a significantly larger percentage of revenue compared to the Geneva sales. And here we see pictures of 2 of their highlights, which include the 6239 gold Paul Newman that they sold in Geneva. And I think that went for close to 700,000 Swiss francs. And then the titanium 5033 minute repeater that sold in Hong Kong, that was part of the titanium collection. Last but not least, we have Antiquorum. Now, Antiquorum was able to have 3 sales total, 2 in Geneva and 1 in Hong Kong. It was interesting that they had an early sale in Geneva, kind of in the early days of the COVID thing, and it was quite successful given the circumstances. And then for Antiquorum, Rolex represented the strongest performers in their sales. They had 3 world records set at their June Geneva sale, with the Comex reference 1680 sub bringing 524,000 Swiss francs, a 6034 chronograph in pink gold bringing 600,000 Swiss francs, and a tropical 1680 Submariner bringing 103,000 Swiss francs. And unconfirmed rumors on various blogs state that Rolex themselves were actually the buyer of the 6034 and the 1680 Comex. We can guess at what that means, if they'll open a museum one day or if it'll open a museum to the public. We don't know, but again, these are just rumors, but many places have said this. And Antiquorum also moving forward, they'll be conducting virtual Zoom valuation days starting in the fall. As I said previously, one of the things going on is everybody basically just has to adjust to the new norm. So here we see the two highlights from Antiquorum. On the left, this Comex 1680, and on the right, this 6034 pink gold chronograph. Yeah. So we can summarize what trends we've seen during COVID so far. And basically, bored people sitting at home equal a lot of watch sales online. I don't know if, again, it's a little difficult getting inventory, but a lot of people were selling a lot of watches, and everybody all the sales sides channels benefited from that. Sellers have been adapting to the new norm and have been retooling strategies to cater to the needs of customers. For brands and authorized dealers, this means finding creative ways to sell given physical obstacles, such as indoor shopping being closed and shelter-in-place rules and all these things that are going on right now. Finding good watches to sell is not easy for auction houses, authorized dealers, gray market dealers, and restrictive supplies during this period has further exacerbated demand for watches, which is already strong. Again, like I said earlier, the lack of ability affects everybody, from all the sales channels down to the consumers. Everyone is still waiting for their Aquanauts, Nautiluses, Daytonas, GMTs, and subs. And people looking for that great COVID deal have sorely been disappointed. I think that people need to understand that sometimes getting a good deal doesn't necessarily mean you're buying it for the cheapest price. Sometimes like a great deal is just finding something that you really want that previously you couldn't find. And, you know, as a dealer, I can speak for myself and many other people that, you know, we get a lot of inquiries asking, hey, has the market bottomed out? Have prices fallen? And, you know, honestly, for the most part, they haven't. And then an interesting point here is the confluence of rarity and condition and desirability create for the perfect storm, which I think is pretty self-explanatory. So next, you know, we'll do a few collecting tips and market observations. So this is kind of a mouthful here, but basically lower priced watches produced in higher quantities are bringing lower results unless there's something exceptional about them. For example, remarkable condition. The run up in this market segment has been unsustainable. What do I mean by that? You know, we can talk about things like in the vintage Rolex world, 5513s, 1675 GMTs, 1680 subs, 6263s, 6265 Daytonas. You know, don't get me wrong, these are all watches that are very desirable, but at the same time, they were produced in quite high numbers. I think a lot of times people conflate desirability and rarity, and they're not necessarily either complementary, the same, or whatever. And I think that the market right now has matured to a point that people are realizing that only the cream is rising to the top. There's a reason why two similar looking watches, you know, let's take a 5513 for example, it could be as cheap as $8,000, or it could be as expensive as $28,000 or $38,000. You know, so it's really about the quality of the individual example. And then playing on that same kind of thought process, the more mass produced the watch, the more important the more important condition is. You know, I mentioned like the 5513. It can be any watch, but basically, you know, condition is the most paramount factor in my opinion, especially when it's something mass produced. You know, an example of something like this is when we look at vintage Genta watches like a AP Royal Oak or a Patek Philippe Nautilus 3700 or 3800, you know, one of the vintage examples. And in my mind, when I look at it, you know, or when I visualize it, I always see laying the watch down on a table on the bracelet, and then it either stands up or it sags, meaning the bracelet will stand up and keep its oval shape, or it'll just sag down and lay flat. And, you know, this happens because the bracelet is worn. You know, somebody has given a lot of love over the years. And to me, you know, details like this really make a big difference in the price. And this is an interesting one. Is one of the first things that I learned is there's no such thing as a good deal. You get what you pay for. I feel that any sort of buy and sell is by nature kind of an adversarial relationship. The seller obviously wants the most they can get out of something, and the buyer wants to pay as little as possible. And to me, the best deal is a fair one, and one that may mean paying more for something you wanted, but getting something of worthy condition. And then the market is bigger than any one seller. What I mean is that, you know, things like, don't be mad at that guy on Instagram that took a picture of 20 new Rolex green subs on a table. You know, the truth is that if the desirability wasn't so high, A, he wouldn't have 20 of them on the table, and B, you wouldn't even care that he took that photo. And I think that, you know, these are all, you know, things that are attributable to any sort of market economics, and it is what the market will bear. And at some point, if people decide that, you know, a green Submariner is not worth that, the prices will go down, and maybe you'll want one still, maybe you won't. And then here's like an interesting thought to kind of end on about that, is that the changes that were brought to the watchmaker in my eyes, I mean, that were brought to the watch market by COVID were 99% on the selling side and only 1% on the buying side. What do I mean by that? Well, you know, for people buying at home, used to buying on the internet, on the phone, on groups online, on WeChat and whatnot, you know, what that means is that the logistics maybe were a little slower. FedEx waived their guarantees. You maybe got the package a day or two later than usual, but things on the buy side were more or less seamless, like they were before. The difference is I feel like on the selling side, you know, the stores had to adjust to, you know, the shops being closed, their own logistical problems, things such as even like replenishing supplies, dealing with the delays in the supply chain, both getting things and shipping them out. And also just the fact that watches were not easy to source anymore because everybody was at home, you know? So really at the end of the day, I think that what this means is that sellers need to kind of retool how they're doing things to adjust for this kind of market that might be here for some time coming. Now, the last thing that I'll talk about really quickly in passing is Loop This. This is a website that I've been working on with Justin Gruenberg of the Keystone. We've been working on it for quite some time. It'll be ready for launch in a couple of months, and I hope that it becomes one of these sites that's frequented by all collectors, whether you're looking for something to buy or just looking for learning more and engaging with fellow watch enthusiasts. It'll be an auction site. As we get closer to launch time, we'll share more about all the details of how the site will work and how easy it'll be to use. But what I can tell you now, though, is that it'll absolutely be a white glove experience for both buyers and sellers. Until then, stay tuned. And in the words of Ed Richet, that's the end.
Well, thank you, Eric. That was a very interesting lecture, and we can now move on to our Q&A portion of the evening. And the first question, it was submitted earlier via email, so I'm reading it off my phone. This is a question from Corey L, and he asks, Eric, I wonder if you have any sense of Rolex mania possibly slowing down soon. Are new or experienced vintage collectors starting to lean towards any other brands in particular? Or are folks still really clamoring for the 5513s, 1675s, and 1016s as much as they have been for the past few years? What do you think?
Nick, I'm sorry. My audio was a little bit cut off in the beginning. Could you repeat that question one more time?
Sure, no problem. Can you hear me all right now?
Yes.
Okay, so this is a question from Corey L. He's asking if you have any sense if Rolex mania has been slowing down. Are new or experienced vintage collectors starting to lean towards any other brands in particular? Or are folks still really clamoring for the 5513s, 1675s, and 1016s as much as they have been for the past few years?
I mean, I think that Rolex, by virtue of doing such great marketing over the years, there's always going to be like a very strong, loyal following for the brand. And as a result, that's why we see their new watches being in such high demand, as well as so much interest in their vintage pieces, such as 5513s, 1675s, and GMTs and the like. I think that, the interest will always be there. And it's interesting because Rolex has so many different models for people to be interested in, and there's something for everybody. Some people are interested in subs, some people are interested in GMTs, and what we see now is a lot of interest in maybe non-sport models that not necessarily, that are not necessarily the the traditional sport watches that everybody covets, but are things like Datejust with interesting dials. Day dates are obviously very popular. Stella dial day dates, Oyster perpetuals. I made a reference to the fact in a previous interview that I always thought Oyster perpetuals were so interesting because there's so many variations in sizes and makes of those. And, judging from some of their new releases with these colored dials, that'll probably only ignite more interest in vintage ones.
Okay, so we'll move on to the next question. We've got a lot of questions coming in tonight. This question is from Jeffrey Powell. He asks, how do you feel about flipping or buying and selling as an investment class?
I mean, obviously, this is an interesting question to ask somebody who's a watch dealer by trade. What I will say is that, as a dealer or somebody that does this full-time or professionally, I mean, maybe, we are more in tune with, different nuances of the market or the inner goings of what happens. So obviously a dealer, we make money when we buy something, we make money when we sell something. And I just think that as a collector, you can't obviously ignore the fact that these things are very expensive, but at the same time, your primary focus should be in enjoying and loving watches as opposed to, financial gain. And if you're buying watches just to make money, there's a lot more interesting, there's a lot more ways to make money. Maybe not interesting, but there's a lot more ways to make money and a lot more safe things to buy that might have less downside than just speculating on what the newest hot thing is.
Okay, the next question is from Marcelo Dietrich. Marcelo asks, will we get to a point where all watchmakers and their authorized dealers will be online exclusively? That's the trend that we've been seeing. He mentions the gray market and vintage watch area has proved for this to be quite beneficial. So how far is this transition going to go for selling watches online?
I don't know. Can I borrow your crystal ball to answer this one, Nick? you know, in all seriousness, we've all obviously seen a lot of brands transitioning to online sales. I think a lot of the Richemont brands are online. They have their own sales can be conducted via their own website. Mr. Porter is a avenue of sales, I think, for a lot of brands online. And then also, obviously, you know, Hodinkee is an authorized retailer for many shops. This is going to be a tricky thing because traditionally brands have relied on the authorized dealer model. And what that means is that these authorized dealers were granted their kind of exclusive areas geographically. And it's a, you know, it's a tricky thing to either take watches away from these dealers, the partners, and just like, or keep them going the way they are and doing your own online sales, which ultimately eats out of their pockets. So it's a really tricky way that they have to navigate through this type of a situation. I think going forward, we might see some sort of like a hybrid model for some of the big brands that are not online yet. But you know, buying a $50,000 watch, buying a $10,000 watch, buying a $100,000 watch, you know, is a really personal thing. And I think a lot of people enjoy that experience of going into a store, having somebody wait on them there, being shown how a watch works, looking at it, seeing it, touching it, feeling it in person, as opposed to just, you know, entering their credit card number online.
Absolutely. It's that human element that's always going to be there. So our next question is from Sandesh Tuladar. The question is, it's a simple question. What does white glove sell-through mean? You mentioned that earlier on when you're talking about auctions.
Yeah, sure. A white glove sale is when all of the lots are sold. So it's a pretty simple thing, but that just means that every lot was sold. There was nothing that passed.
Okay. And the next question from Brian Standig. He mentions that LVMH called off its merger with Tiffany today. There has been significant press about a drop in luxury sales over the course of the pandemic. How or why is there a disconnect between the so-called luxury market cited in these articles and the continued strong demand in the luxury watch market?
So there's a few different parts of this, and I'll try to take it point by point here or whatever. But, you know, I'll preface this by saying that, you know, on one hand, Tiffany does sell, you know, a $5 million diamond ring. But on the other hand, I would say probably 95% of their sales are $90 silver trinkets and tchotchkes, you know? So using, you know, the word luxury in this particular case, I think is kind of a stretch. You know, they're a big brand. They definitely sell like an image of luxury, but to me, maybe it's more of like a aspirational brand. And, you know, again, they have, in our world, one thing they do sell that is very desirable, obviously, is Patek Philippe co-branded watches. You know, if you think a 5711 is hot, that extra tiny line of text on a Tiffany 5711, you know, it's going to get you into all the clubs, get you the best table at a restaurant. You know, really, that's what everybody wants, you know, and it's kind of silly, but it's the truth. So obviously that is something like very relevant to our world, but, you know, I don't necessarily see the Tiffany brand as, you know, representative of like the luxury market as whole, because you have to remember too, like, you know, the fancy malls always have like a Tiffany boutique, like in the corner somewhere. And probably a lot of their sales are derived in person that way. The boutique on Fifth Avenue in New York, in San Francisco, wherever, in Beverly Hills, like they rely on a lot of these stores to generate a lot of their sales through tourism, through whatever, and that obviously isn't happening right now. My personal opinion about the merger being called off, you know, who knows? I don't think this is the end of the story. I think this could be a negotiating tactic of some sort. You know, we're not really sure, but, you know, we'll see what happens.
Okay. Next question from Hamza Masood. Hi, Hamza. Nice to see you online and asking questions tonight. He asks, have you seen data from seller platforms other than Chrono24 that also support the theory that online sales have gone up in this time?
You know, Chrono24 being the kind of like the big platform like for watch sales online, you know, this 13% that I saw was gathered from an interview, I think by Watchanista with the CEO of Chrono24. I don't have specific other examples gathered by you know, like other data points like that, but I have spoken to a lot of other you know, gray market dealers with colleagues of mine, and you know, basically everybody said that sales have been up. You know, nobody says, oh, I really, you know, my sales have been suffering because of COVID.
Okay. Eric, how you doing with questions? You good to keep going for a bit?
Yeah, we're good.
Okay.
Let's keep going for a bit.
The reason I ask is we have 38 questions in the queue. So obviously we're not going to have time to get through all of these questions tonight. But I know that Eric is very responsive on Instagram. So if we don't have time for your question tonight, maybe shoot him a text later today or tomorrow and see if you could follow up with him.
Sure.
But this next question we have from Joseph Schwartz. He asks, can you give your input on Rolex's 41mm releases and how you think they will affect the resales of 40 and 39mm Rolexes?
Resale, that naughty word. Anyways, you know, to be honest with you, with the new Oyster Perpetual, I went with a 36mm with a yellow dial. You know, it's kind of funny that Rolex started with this 36mm size in the 1950s, and you know, they just got it right, in my opinion. It's the perfect size. I think it's for men, it's for women, and that really attracted me to it. I'll admit that I haven't been able to see a 41mm in person, and from what I read online, people that have bought them say that it wears smaller than the size would indicate. But you know, for me, I kind of feel like 36 is the best. Now, obviously, there's been a continuing trend for like larger sizes in general. So probably the 41 will outsell the 36. But you know, like the other ones, I don't. You know, like in terms of the 40 and 39, you know, I think the sizes are pretty similar. I don't necessarily anticipate like a significant differential in the different sizes, value-wise.
Okay. Next up, we have a question from Zach Blass. Zach asks, what watches have vintage, smaller references that sell for less than their modern counterparts at retail? And he gives the example of the 3800 versus the 5711. Do you know of any?
Sell that less than retail. I mean, you know, the 3800 is obviously one example, the smaller size Nautilus. I think you could probably also lump in like Aquanauts in that. You know, it's kind of interesting. The Aquanaut, that was my first Patek Philippe. And, you know, they had different sizes, a 5065, which was called the Jumbo at the time, but seems quite small by current standards. Those have actually seen quite a lot of appreciation these days. So I don't think that they're lower than retail versus a new one. But a 5066 is a slightly smaller one that might still be. And then, you know, obviously you have a whole bunch of different references of AP Royal Oaks that are selling for less than a 15202 or a 15500 right now. So those are something that are also worth considering.
Okay. Thank you for that question, Zach. Next up is John Tiefert. John Tiefert is the new president of the Horological Society of New York, and it's great to have this question here from him. So he asks, Eric, I wonder if you have any insights for mere mortals. And by that, I mean, for the mass-produced watches you touched on at the end of your lecture, Is there any market you prefer over another, eBay or Chrono 24? What do you think?
I mean, look, I think, it's kind of one of the oldest markets online, but really eBay is the most interesting to me. You can buy high, you can buy low, you can buy in between. You can buy all sorts of weird things. You can buy anything on eBay that's legal, I should say. And, I'll admit, I still browse eBay all the time. There's something interesting about it because you're buying not necessarily just from professional sellers, but also from, like a random guy in Massachusetts. You're buying from, maybe an old lady in Arizona or something. And, there's something really interesting about buying something that people call quote unquote fresh. It can be a Submariner that somebody wore for 20 years and then decided to sell on his own and is pleasantly surprised at the current value. Or, like an old lady selling a Mickey Mouse Ingersoll watch from the 1930s that she's had since she was like a kid. That might not be very expensive, but it's something that, is very interesting and I find really endearing. For me, like, I still think eBay is the go-to for buying all sorts of fun things and for killing time when I have nothing else to do on the internet.
I agree with you 100%.
Yeah.
So we have one other question from John Tieferts. John asks, as HSNY is a watchmakers organization, first and foremost, he understands you do a lot of business with vintage watches. What's your feel of the current situation with watchmakers and watch service in the USA?
This is a very, very good question. And I see that we haven't lost too many people. There's still 314 people in the room here. But I cannot emphasize enough the lack of qualified watchmakers in the United States and probably in the rest of the world. As you guys may or may not know, one of the businesses that I own is called the Los Angeles Watchworks. We're based in Southern California, and we do restoration and servicing of anything from vintage watches to to modern watches. And, I would love to expand that business. We have a nice big office that can fit many more benches. We currently have around 8 employees right now. And, it's really interesting because every year the watch schools in the United States, that are well known and I kind of accredited or whatever, obviously Lilith's in Pennsylvania and the watchmaking school in Seattle. And I remember maybe 2 years ago, one of my colleagues there had told me that their graduating class, I think, only had 11 or 12 people in it. And so you combine that, like East and West Coast, we're talking about at best maybe 20 or 30 something new qualified watchmakers graduating out of the programs every year. And that's not enough to go around to all of the brands, let alone any independent service centers or anything like that. And, watchmaking for various reasons can be a very rewarding occupation. And, the pay is not bad. I'll tell you that for sure. And I think that, doing a lot more kind of outreach in terms of getting people engaged in learning about watchmaking and possibly as a career, this could be something really interesting. I don't know. I think most of you know there's a movie coming out that Nick has been involved in called The Keeper of Time, which will be out in a month or two. And the goal of the director, and then the goal of that is to kind of, I think, get people engaged, interested in watchmaking, the history of it, and ultimately to be able to see whether or not we can have more watchmakers, come out of this. And, I think that it's a shame, really. I mean, I don't want it to be like one of these lost professions. And I think that while the interest is very strong from the collecting standpoint, we need to do whatever we can to ensure that there's more watchmakers that are, that are coming out. And that will be able to service our watches, years from now.
Well, those are some wise words. I totally agree with you. It's really a big mission of the Horological Society of New York to promote watchmaking as a career as much as we possibly can. People don't realize how much fun it is. It's one of these things that never gets old. So I agree with you. We need to promote it and let people know that it's something that they really can get into. Okay, let's see what else we have here. We have a question from Praveen Kanan. Praveen asks, what are your thoughts on the impact of COVID sales on cross-border transactions in this new reality? For example, do you see any increase in sales from buyers in the US buying from dealers outside the US?
This is actually an interesting question that opens itself up to, like, I think a deeper and a more interesting conversation that I think will become quite a relevant thing moving forward. But we all know that the Supreme Court ruled on these sales tax rules, for example, and then if we follow the letter of the law, I would say more than 70% of us should be paying sales tax on a watch that we buy, whether it's from in-state, out-of-state, or whatever. The truth is probably compliance is a little low right now. But, I think that because in the United States, we don't have like a nationwide VAT or anything like that, that the way that these sales tax rules have set up kind of have, given us this false expectation that when you see the retail price of a watch, that this is what you should be paying. The truth is that you have sales tax on top of that. So I think that, COVID has taught us, look, everything is going through mail right now, or remotely. And, interesting, I know that some of the 300 of you still participating here have probably gotten weird letters from Federal Express, from your state franchise tax board or taxing authority that says that, hey, on so-and-so date, you bought this at this value from overseas, and we're just reminding you that you may or may not owe use tax on that. And I think all these things, in the grand scheme of things, like, look, it hurts in the beginning when nobody's doing it, but when everybody's doing it and it becomes ubiquitous, you realize, like, that's part of the equation, and there's no going around it. So I don't know if this kind of answers your question or not, but I think that because everything is being transacted remotely now, and if this becomes something that continues to be like the status quo of how we do business, I think that the authorities will take a more detailed look at things, and basically, we should all be more compliant than not. So there you go.
All right, the next question is from Ronnie Madhvani. He asks, are brands becoming more responsive to customers, for example, in terms of watch case sizing? Are they becoming smaller, or are they just producing pieces based on their heritage? And he cites Cartier as an example.
Hey, Ronnie, how's it going? It's pretty interesting because, I know you and I both share a passion for Cartier watches. One thing that I can say is that ultimately at the end of the day, like, we vote with our checkbooks, right? If a watchmaker makes something that we don't like or is crappy, it just won't sell well. And if it doesn't sell well, they don't make money. And if they don't make money, there's no point in making it for them, So I think brands have become a lot more receptive to this. Maybe it has to do with the economic climate, not necessarily because of COVID, but, the economic climate of the last several years of, increased sales in the luxury goods segment and whatnot. I think that, for example, like, people love, a lot of times, we realize now that people love vintage watches. Hoyer, every brand has their iconic models that they're known for. And, as cliched as it is, Like, this is like printing money for the brands, you know? There's obviously more respectful ways of doing things than other in terms of production volume, certain attributes or whatever. But, you know, brands that have survived 50, 100, 200 years, their strongest trick in their bag is their heritage, and then, you know, the classics that they've made in the past. So occasional reinterpretations of these things, I think, are a way of respecting their tradition and history.
Well said. Okay, we have a question from David Roessler. David asks, do you think COVID has helped, hurt, or had no effect on the smaller independents compared to other big brands?
I think that I should have mentioned this during the discussion, but I do think that you know, our friends, independent watchmakers, you know, probably are faring a little. They're probably not doing as well as they were pre-COVID. Maybe more so than the big brands. You know, independent watchmakers, they run the gamut of the guy that you have to wait 5 years for, that has orders sold out until whatever, 2025. And they also, you know, the flip side of that is the guy that is sitting there waiting for an order and then, you know, getting paid for that order and using that money to buy supplies to make the next watch, to keep the electricity on and at his atelier or whatever. So the term like independent watchmaking really has like a broad definition. And I definitely feel that a lot of independent watchmakers are probably hurting a little more just because of sheltering in place, because of logistical complications, materials of supplies getting to them, and all those type of things, you know? So if anything, I would encourage any of you guys that have been thinking about buying some independent watchmaker to go ahead, pull the trigger, send your deposit, you know, be engaged with them, you know, and kind of be part of this process. Because, you know, I think that the most interesting part of purchasing an independent watch is that you are part of the creating process, and, you know, you're like a patron, like in the old days, like, you know, you're a patron of the arts. You're helping them, you know, do what they do, and helping them be able to make the next model that they make, or, you know, buy the supplies and materials to make the next watch that they make somebody else. So you really, your dollars spent with an independent small watchmaker go significantly further than a brand, than your dollars spent with like a multinational billion-dollar corporation.
Okay, and speaking of multinational billion-dollar corporations, this next question is very relevant. Bob Gallimore asks, do you anticipate the COVID situation causing or hastening the restructuring, refocusing, or elimination of any of the brands in the major groups like the Swatch Group, Richemont, or LVMH?
I mean, the funny thing is I feel like, you know, the brands, actually, I would say probably all of the brands, you know, they have some sort of like a heritage. All the brands that are around right now that are owned by the big groups, you know, they have some sort of a historical record. I mean, they love saying like, oh, so-and-so brand founded in 1812, founded in 1912 or whatever. And I think that by virtue of kind of being around for so long, every brand, even the brand that you yourself might hate, has loyal customers. And I think it would be a really extreme thing for one of the conglomerates to, you know, to cancel out or close out one of their brands. I'm not saying that it's not going to happen, but, you know, personally, I don't really see that we're quite anywhere near that type of a thing happening. So. Okay.
How are you feeling? Maybe one or two more questions before we wrap it up? Okay.
Sure.
All right. We've still got a large group of people, about 274 people still watching, still tuned in. So the next question is from Philip Chan. Philip asks, have you seen a rise in interest for the Rolex turnograph? I've noticed this model coming up more on forums, and he's interested to hear your take on that model.
This is a very specific question, which is good. You know, it's funny. The Rolex Turnograph is the grandfather of all of the Rolex sport models, and for whatever reason, it just was never really given its due. And I do agree with you. I see a lot of people kind of like being more interested in it, and a lot of it, I think, also has to do with the fact that people are realizing these things, and that it's the archetype for all sport Rolexes, but also that, you know, a 6204 Submariner, one of the first Submariners, you know, made in 1954 or 55, right now in nice condition, you know, is a six-figure watch easily, bringing, you know, $150,000, $200,000. But a 6202 Turnograph that was made basically the same time, that if you showed your wife that was not a watch nerd, looked at it, she would say basically it looks 95% the same. You know, this is like a $25,000 watch. It's just like kind of insane, you know? So obviously I think there's a value play there. People realize that it's kind of undervalued. And, you know, that being said, I think they are, you know, going to be seeing a rise in value, and I think people appreciate them more. And, you know, like with Rolex, a lot of the interesting things about collecting them is that there's so many variations, even across a model, and specifically across even one reference number. There's so many different variations. You know, with the Turnograph, just off of the top of my head, I myself can think of, you know, 4 or 5 different variants. So, you know, there's a lot of different, you know, there's a lot of variety there. There's something at many different price points. There are some variants that are more pricey than others. But again, like some of your basic ones are still quite affordable. So I think, you know, that's a good catch. I think Turnographs are pretty good, and, you know, the values probably will continue to appreciate.
Okay, so let's get to the last question for the evening. Rick Harari asks, Eric, what is your philosophy on servicing vintage pieces? Should you avoid it unless absolutely necessary, or stick to a maximum service interval?
So this is an interesting question. As I mentioned before, I own a watch servicing business, and you know, we do a lot of service in not only new but vintage watches as well. And you know, a lot of people ask about servicing, like how often you should do it. Should I do it at all? Polishing watches, things of this nature. And look, I mean, obviously originality is the best. But, you know, I don't agree with the fact that, you know, polishing a watch has become kind of a bad word. I think that, you know, if you have a watch right now from the 1950s and it's been serviced at any point prior to your ownership, more likely or not, it's been polished. You know, it's a pretty standard thing when a watch goes back to the factory to get serviced. That includes like a polishing of the case. You know, whether the technician was really good at what they did or bad, you know, that's a different thing. But, you know, I'm sorry, but 99% of the watches out there that you think are unpolished are actually polished. You know, in terms of the servicing side of things, you know, it's kind of interesting. There is some inherent risk with servicing older watches. I can tell you anecdotally, I had a 6538 Big Crown Submariner with a really beautiful glossy dial. That's something now that is probably worth, I don't know, $500,000–$600,000. I found it fresh. It was never serviced, and it was really, really rough. I mean, the watch, like, you couldn't see through the crystal. You know, it was sitting in the drawer somewhere in a garage, and it was really, really rough. But, you know, when you removed the crystal, you could see that the dial was really beautiful. The watch completely didn't work. The movement was seized together, and it absolutely had to be serviced. So what happened was, you know, entrusting it to the best watchmaker I knew at the time, we took it apart. And when it came to pulling the hands off, you know, the hands had kind of rusted and slightly fused with a pinion on there, and it required a tremendous amount of force. So as careful as we were, when we pulled it off, it basically damaged the dial. I mean, you know, it was catastrophic. I thought I was going to kill myself afterwards. It happens. I mean, it's part of these type of things, but you know, this is something that happens very seldomly, but I'm not going to say that it doesn't happen. So, you know, with a lot of like vintage watches, if they've had like somewhat of a normal service regimen, you know, taking things apart, disassembling them, replacing parts, servicing them, it's fairly easy. I mean, any like competent trained watchmaker should be able to do these things, but there are certain case specific variances that cause complications that make you think about, you know, think twice about, you know, servicing something. So my general rule of thumb is like, look, if it really needs to be serviced and it doesn't run, like I'll go ahead and service it. But at the same time, I don't adhere to like a fixed schedule. Like if I have a really nice gilt dial Submariner, I don't think that I need to service it every 3 years or every 4 years or whatever. I kind of think that I'd wear it until it doesn't really keep time anymore.
All right, well, thank you, Eric, for the excellent lecture tonight. Thank you for being the first lecturer to speak live streamed at HSNY in our entire history. This is really a special night, so I'm really appreciative of you doing this this evening. And thank you for sticking around for so many questions and answers tonight.
Thank you. Thank you all for tuning in.
All right. So we'll see everyone back here for our October meeting. It will also be a Zoom meeting, and we have our friends from Ferdinand Berthoud delivering a lecture. It's going to be Mr. Schäufele and Mr. Lepere, speaking about the history of Ferdinand Berthoud and their quest for excellence and precision, talking a bit about their marine chronometer history, all the way up to the brand new Remontois watch that you see on the screen right now. So that's going to be really a fascinating lecture. And keep in mind the different time. So this is going to be at 1 p.m. Eastern time to take into account the different time zone in Switzerland, because they're going to be joining us live from Switzerland. All right, so we'll see everyone back here Monday, October 5th. Thank you very much and have a great night.